At 5:41 p.m. on a Tuesday, the exact time etched in green LED above the oven and on the slim margin of my phone, I learned the final lesson in the lifelong seminar of trust. It arrived as a text from Paige, my daughter-in-law by bloodless merger, delivered with the efficiency of a weather alert. We found a loving family for Scout. He'll have a yard. The period at the end of the sentence felt less like punctuation than a brick dropped from height. Consider subscribing so stories like this don't stay unseen. There is a breed of pain that arrives in increments, the slow encroachment of loss that begins not with the vanishing itself, but the anticipation. I had suspected the dog was living on borrowed time in that house. From the moment Wyatt had married Paige, who wore ambition the way other women wore eyeliner, thick and defining, I watched the slow demotion of Scout in the family order. At first, he was allowed on the furniture, then only the floor, then the garage with the unfinished drywall and the sour dust. I had documented each regression in a notebook meant for tracking my own medication schedule, a sad ledger of boundaries drawn and redrawn. Still, I pretended not to see the trajectory. I imagined that love, once installed, was as permanent as the fixtures you drove into the studs. It is possible I gave my son and his wife too much credit. It is possible, as Dr. Romero once told me in the context of canine cognition, that hope is an overdeveloped prefrontal cortex's greatest liability. At 5:44 p.m., I sent a reply. Was this discussed with me? The phone made its soft, apologetic whoosh. The answer arrived less than a minute later, a marvel of politeness and plausible deniability. We didn't want to burden you, Elias. The new owners seem wonderful. They sent photos. An exclamation point this time, which stung more than the period. I should clarify that I have never been a sentimentalist about animals. Growing up, we rotated through strays and working dogs. The attachment measured less in affection than in utility and the price of feed. But Scout was different. I'd taken him in the winter after my wife died, a rescue with half a tail and two eyes of mismatched conviction. Wyatt was living out of state at the time, but he returned for the funeral. And the first thing Scout did was nose his way into Wyatt's lap and stay there, motionless, until Wyatt's sobbing passed. I never forgot it, and I never let Scout forget it either. He was there for every holiday and backyard barbecue, a quiet overseer, a dark streak against the grass. The last time he visited was Easter. I still had the grocery receipt with dog rawhide treat in Paige's handwriting. I returned the leash to its nail and pressed my hand flat to my chest, as though the organ inside needed a reminder to keep its tempo. My thoughts became staccato, brief flashes. Should I call Wyatt and confront? Should I demand an address? Should I get in the car and drive out? Make a scene? Each option presented itself and receded. Instead, I reached for the notepad by the fridge, yellow, lined with things to do at the header, and added a new line. Scout, follow up with Paige. I wrote it in pencil, with pressure, as if pressing hard enough could turn it into fact. The rain continued its performance, and the house felt doubly silent in its wake. There is a geometry to loneliness, the way rooms expand when they are no longer shared. I considered eating dinner, leftover rotisserie chicken and steamed carrots, but found the thought insipid. I watched television for exactly 23 minutes, an old detective show where the case was always solved and the dead were rarely missed. I fell asleep in my chair, upright and still dressed, and woke to the unfamiliar sound of a knock on my front door at 7:10 p.m. It was the neighbor from 2 doors down, the one with the unpredictable schedule and the pair of small, indistinguishable children. She stood beneath the eaves, soaked and shivering, her face arranged in that particular expression people reserve for breaking news. "Mr. Morton?" she said, voice already loaded with apology. "I'm so sorry to bother you." "There's a dog by the curb." I thanked her in a voice that sounded remote, like I was speaking on behalf of a man I'd just met. I put on my raincoat, checked the snap closures 3 times, and stepped outside into the halogen blur of the streetlight. The curb was a shallow river of runoff, grass drowned in mud, trash can tipped at a tired angle. Scout lay at the water's edge, one paw arched and rigid, the black of his coat slicked to a sheen. There was no ambiguity in the set of his body. He was too still to be waiting, too close to my porch to be called rehomed. I crouched beside him and touched the spot behind his ear, the place where he'd always leaned into my hand. I don't know what I expected. To feel a spark, a pulse, some evidence of a last-minute reversal. There was only the certainty of a finished story. I sat beside him, cross-legged on the saturated concrete, and waited for the right emotion to arrive. It did not come in a rush, but as a slow filling well, a mixture of guilt, disappointment, and the fragile pride of having known love that could be lost. I stayed there until the neighbor's porch light flickered out, and the street was left to the sound of rainfall and the low, insistent hum of passing cars. At 7:41 p.m., I pulled my phone from my coat and texted Paige. "I found Scout. He was here. Thank you for letting me know." The message went undelivered for 3 minutes, then returned a red receipt and nothing else. I did not expect an answer, and none came. Inside, I toweled Scout's body dry and placed him on the old dog bed in the mudroom, arranging him as though he might resume his afternoon nap at any moment. I found myself talking to him, a habit I had never broken even when he was a room away and oblivious. "You were good," I said, and then, because it felt true, "You did everything right." I draped a faded towel over his body, the same towel he'd stolen off the line as a puppy, and sat with him until the numbers on the oven clock turned over to 9, then 10, then 11. At midnight, I went to the hall closet and found the box of spare keys, the ones I had made for friends, for Wyatt, for Paige, for the neighbor who watered my plants when I traveled. I weighed them in my palm, cold and indistinguishable. There is a ritual to love, and another to its undoing. I took the keys to the kitchen, placed them on the counter, and made a list of every lock in my house. In the morning, I would change them all, not out of spite or anger, but out of a simple need to put a barrier between what once was and what now remained. I returned to the mudroom and sat beside Scout, feeling the weight of silence expand to fill the entire house. There are many ways to lose faith in the people you trust, but only one to reclaim the dignity that remains. I ran my hand along the ridges of Scout's back, and for the first time in decades, allowed myself to weep without witness. There was a time I believed that devotion could be measured, even graphed if one was sufficiently meticulous. I had kept records, literal files, annotated and color-coded, of the tasks by which I tried to keep my corner of the world from coming apart. The hours spent crawling through the crawl space each autumn, hands numb and knuckles bloodied from resetting insulation. The overtime at the plant, logged by fiscal quarter in a ledger, I still couldn't throw away. Every shift a sacrament to the mortgage company, the orthodontist, the hope that Wyatt would someday look in the mirror and see more than the crooked teeth of his childhood. It was always small things at first, the quirk of the furnace, the patch of shingles that insisted on peeling away, the kitchen faucet's passive-aggressive drip. Each demanded a night or a weekend, always more time than expected. But I met them with a stubborn sense of stewardship, convinced that as long as I attended to the leaks and the cracks, the structure itself would hold. When Wyatt was young, he would trail me on these missions, tool belt oversized, hands eager for instruction. Later, he outgrew the need to follow, then outgrew the home itself. The repairs became quieter, the tools put away with a discipline bordering on ceremonial. After retirement, the rituals grew more pronounced. I would rise before sunrise, the house echoing with the click of Scout's nails as he paced his patrol route from living room to back door. The vet said the old dog's hips were degenerating, the kind of diagnosis that makes you think of rot and entropy even as you spoon kibble into the bowl. I bought frozen peas in the family-size bags, rotating them from freezer to towel to Scout's haunches, each compress a makeshift offering against pain. The peas were always on sale, so I hoarded them, the freezer crowded with the evidence of my intent to outpace the inevitable. There were appointments for shots, surgeries, dentals. I attended every one, kept the receipts and the after-visit summaries in a blue folder labeled Scout, arranged in reverse chronology. At night I would thumb through them, not because I needed to remember the dates, but because it reassured me to see the pattern. A line of care, uninterrupted, as if by maintaining the ledger I could keep the years from thinning out. I did the same with the people I loved. Wyatt's old report cards, the letters he sent from freshman year, the thank you notes from teachers who appreciated the cupcakes I brought to every open house. Even Paige's first Christmas card, the one where she signed her name with a smiley face above the I. I wasn't sentimental, just methodical, convinced that in the absence of faith, what mattered was proof of effort. Love, as I understood it, was a matter of record. But the flaw in the system was that you could only account for your own actions. The rest was guesswork. You could log every hour, document every sacrifice, and still have no guarantee that the people you cared for would see it, let alone reciprocate. I suppose I knew that before Wyatt married Paige, before the job in Spokane and the slow, ritualized estrangement of a son from his father. But it took the loss of Scout to make the math unavoidable. On Tuesday nights, I would sometimes walk the perimeter of the house, checking the latches on the gates, the deadbolts on the doors, the padlocks on the shed where I kept the tools. I told myself it was for security, but really, it was to convince myself that I hadn't overlooked something, that I was still capable of identifying and neutralizing threats before they breached the perimeter. I had learned, late, that most dangers were not external, but bred from within. Neglect, distraction, the subtle erosion of trust. That night, after returning Scout's body to its place in the mudroom, I made another circuit of the house, flashlight in hand, taking inventory of every weak point. The east gutter needed reseating. The fence by the alley had sagged another quarter-inch since last week. I took notes, then transferred them to the repairs spreadsheet on my desktop, a document so exhaustive that once, when Wyatt visited, he'd laughed and said I should just rent my brain to Home Depot. I pretended to take it as a compliment. I thought about the leash on its hook, the folder of vet records, the years of quiet routines. I wondered if Wyatt would ever understand that the routines were not just for the dog, or the house, or even for him, but for me. A way to stitch meaning into days that would otherwise unravel. I wondered if Paige ever noticed the small acts. The gas card slipped into their mailbox before road trips. The holiday dinners arranged around her schedule. The way I never complained when plans changed at the last minute, because I wanted so badly for her to feel at home. Standing in the kitchen at 2 a.m., I watched the rain bead on the window and thought about the text from Paige. I could see her crafting it, careful to avoid blame or sentiment, offering up the dog's rehoming as though it were a favor to me. I tried to imagine the loving family she'd conjured for Scout, the yard she'd invoked. I tried, and failed, to picture a scenario in which such a decision could be made without malice, only expedience. Perhaps that was the cruelest thing about living long enough to watch patterns repeat. You could always spot the lie, but you were powerless to correct it. I sat at the table and opened the file marked Scout. I added a new page, documenting the events of the evening. Deceased, I wrote. Then the date and time, the circumstances, the condition of the body. I listed possible causes: exposure, neglect, heartbreak, knowing that the most accurate answer was all of the above. At the bottom, I signed my name and the hour, a final entry in the ledger of a life I had tried, to the best of my ability, to sustain. There was comfort in the act, if not the outcome. I closed the folder, stacked it neatly atop the others, and turned off the kitchen light. The house was not silent. It would never be truly silent again. But in the spaces left behind by Scout, and by every act of care that went unacknowledged, I found a kind of clarity. The certainty that whatever else could be said of my life, the record would show I had not faltered in my duty. That would have to be enough. In the hours after the rain, when the house was once again just a house and not the last sanctuary of a dog I failed to protect, I set about the only task that made sense: constructing a record. I had always coped by cataloging, by converting grief into itemized steps, by doing what the world never seemed to do for me, preserving the evidence, unadorned and unassailable. I started with the leash, which hung like a question from its nail. I photographed it from 3 angles: straight on, profile, and the close-up where the clasp was worn nearly to silver. Next came the phone, screen illuminated with Paige's message: "We found a loving family for Scout. He'll have a yard." I held the phone above the kitchen table, made sure her contact photo was in the frame, and snapped 2 shots for redundancy. I moved to the curb, where Scout had lain, though by now the city's morning had dried the puddles and smoothed the mud. I knelt at the scene, photographing the shallow divot pressed into the earth, the wet outline of fur in the grass, the ring of water-stained concrete where his head had rested. On impulse, I fetched the old towel, the one I'd draped over him, blue with fraying edges, a relic from a different house and a different life, and documented that as well. I wanted, perhaps needed, to show that he had not been left completely alone. Returning inside, I compiled the images into a folder on my desktop, labeling it with the date and the words, "Incident, Scout." I opened my email, attached the photos, and addressed them to myself, as if the act of sending would make them more real, more likely to persist should everything else be lost or denied. The next step was video. I accessed the doorbell camera, a feature I had once resented for its constant alerts, but now regarded as a gift. It took less than a minute to find the file. Page, 2:16 p.m. Entering the side gate with 2 teenagers in tow. They wore hoodies and ball caps, carried a generic blue pet carrier between them, and moved with the caution of people unsure if they were trespassing or not. Paige led the way, keys jangling, her mouth drawn in a line I recognized from every Thanksgiving table where she'd ever sat. She knocked, performed a token wait, then unlocked the door and disappeared inside. A full 7 minutes later, they re-emerged without the carrier. The camera didn't catch the handoff, but it didn't need to. The record was clear. I watched the footage twice, once in real time and once frame by frame, the way I used to analyze safety tapes at work for potential hazards. I noted timestamps, pausing to jot down every relevant interval. At the end, I saved the video to my hard drive and backed it up to a thumb drive, which I labeled with my sharpest pen, 2:16 p.m., Scout. It was after this that the emotional reality caught up to the procedural one. I sat at the kitchen table, Scout's file open in front of me, and stared at the collection of facts and images, feeling both vindicated and hollow. It was one thing to know you were right, another to have the cold record confirm it. The house felt emptier with every new addition to the archive. At 9:30, I called Animal Control. The man who answered introduced himself as Officer Chen. He listened while I explained, in measured detail, what had happened. How Scout was old but not dying. How he'd been rehomed without my knowledge. how I'd found him dead by the curb less than 5 hours after receiving Paige's text. I cited the date, the time, the temperature, and the approximate distance from the house to the street. There was a pause on the line. I could hear him entering information into a system, the faint clicking of keys, and the soft sigh of someone who'd heard versions of this story before. "We can send someone out," he said. "Do you have the remains?" "Yes," I replied. "In the mudroom." "He's clean." I put him on his bed. Another pause, shorter this time. "Has he been microchipped?" "He has," I said. "Numbers in his vet file. I can provide it if you need." "That would be helpful." I could almost hear him sitting up, the professional tone tightening, getting ready for the next step. "We'll open a case for suspected abandonment under city code. Is anyone else living at the property?" "Just me," I wanted to add. Just me and the ghosts of everyone I've ever failed, but refrained. "I'll be there within the hour," said Officer Chen. "If possible, please keep the animal inside and undisturbed." I nodded, even though he could not see. "I will." The visit itself was as clinical as a house call from a utility inspector. Officer Chen arrived precisely at 10:27, his uniform immaculate, clipboard tucked under his arm. He introduced himself again at the door, then asked to see Scout. I led him to the mudroom, where the body lay beneath the towel, and watched as he donned a pair of blue nitrile gloves before lifting the edge of the fabric. He studied the dog's body with the practiced detachment of a man who'd performed this rite more times than he cared to admit. "Good weight for his age," he commented, eyes scanning for marks or wounds. "No signs of advanced neglect." "How was his appetite?" "Normal, until the day before." I hesitated, then offered. "He still took treats. Liked ice cubes." Chen nodded, entering the information on his form. "And when was the last time you saw him alive?" "Sunday. They picked him up Monday morning. I didn't get the text until late Tuesday." He continued to write. "And you said you have video of the exchange?" I brought him to the computer, queued up the doorbell footage, and let it play. He watched with the focus of a technician, pausing only to request a closer look at the teens, their clothing, the make and model of the car idling in the background. "May I copy this file?" he asked. I handed him the thumb drive. "Already prepared." He offered a small, professional smile, the kind that passes for gratitude in jobs where emotions are best kept in check. "This will help." We returned to the mudroom. "Do you want to scan the microchip?" I asked. He shook his head. "You said the vet has the number?" "Yes, I can call Dr. Romero. He's been Scout's vet since puppyhood." "That would be best." He closed his notebook, careful not to snap the elastic too loud. "We'll issue a case number. City code considers this a possible abandonment, especially with the age of the animal and the weather conditions. I recommend a necropsy to establish cause of death. Would you like to proceed?" I thought about the word. Necropsy, not autopsy, a distinction I hadn't considered but suddenly understood. "Yes," I said, voice steady. "I want the truth on file." He thanked me, left a card on the kitchen table, and let himself out with a soft click of the latch. I waited until I was certain he'd pulled away before sitting down at the table, card in hand, and dialing Dr. Romero. His line rang twice before he picked up, the familiar timbre of his voice, tired but unfailingly kind, anchoring me to a world that still contained something like decency. "Elias," he said, and in the way he said my name I could tell he already knew. "Doc," I replied, the word catching in my throat. "It's time." He was silent, then, "Bring him by in the morning. We'll take good care of him." I thanked him, hung up, and added the new task to my running list. Then, because it was the only way I knew to signal to the universe that I had not yet surrendered, I emailed the case number and a brief summary of the events to myself, copying Officer Chen and Dr. Romero on the thread. The rest of the night was spent cross-referencing everything I'd recorded, making sure the timeline was airtight. I knew, even then, that the world did not reward diligence or care, but in the absence of anyone else who could bear witness to the truth, I resolved to be enough on my own. By dawn, the world outside my window had been wrung of all excess, the grass slicked flat, and the street shining with the memory of last night's storm. I dressed as if for a formal appointment, pressed shirt, dark slacks, the watch I reserved for occasions when keeping time mattered. I loaded Scout into the car, wrapped in the towel and gently nested in a cardboard box, the kind that once held copy paper, but now served as a crude sarcophagus. I drove the familiar route to Dr. Romero's clinic, hands so tight on the wheel that the joints ached by the second red light. I arrived 10 minutes early, as I always did, and parked in the shade of the only tree left in the lot. The building was a converted bungalow, the walls painted a color that wanted to be blue but settled for something closer to resignation. I carried Scout inside, feeling the weighted presence in my arms, and was greeted at the desk by the receptionist, new since my last visit, her voice artificially bright, but her eyes sharp enough to read the situation before I spoke a word. "Dr. Romero will see you right away," she said, motioning me to the small exam room off the waiting area. The room was unchanged from the last decade, a row of chairs for nervous pet owners, a faded poster outlining the canine skeletal system, a jar of dog biscuits with the same cartoon on the label. I placed the box on the stainless steel table and sat with my hands folded, willing myself to open the folder in my lap until the vet arrived. He entered at 9 o'clock exactly, a man who'd traded hair color for authority and now wore his salt and pepper beard as a credential. His coat was crisp, but the sleeves bore faint brown stains, coffee, iodine, or the remnant of a morning spent with less fortunate creatures. "Elias," he said, with the gentle gravity reserved for terminal consults and old friends. "Thank you for coming in." I nodded, unable to manage a greeting. He approached the table, opening the box and peeling back the towel with reverence. He checked Scout's gums, lifted an eyelid, ran his hands along the spine and hips as though the act might still elicit a reflex. Satisfied, he closed the towel and turned to the computer. "You wanted the records?" he asked, though he knew the answer. He navigated with economy. 2 clicks, a password, and the whole of Scout's medical life illuminated on the screen. He read the summary aloud as he printed it. "Current on vaccinations as of February. Last checkup 6 weeks ago. Good body mass, mild arthritis, no terminal issues, no prescribed medications except joint supplement." He looked at me over the rim of his glasses. "He wasn't dying, Elias. You were right about that." I felt the statement like a verdict, exoneration mixed with the misery of being correct in the most useless way. "Thank you," I said. It came out smaller than intended. He loaded a chip scanner and held it against Scout's side. It beeped, the number appearing on a strip of LCD. He jotted it on a yellow sticky note and affixed it to the printout. "City needs confirmation. They'll want to see the full chain of custody." "I have the case number," I replied, offering him the slip Officer Chen had left on my table. He scanned it, then attached it to the growing dossier in front of him. "I'll perform the necropsy myself," he said, his voice steady, but his hands betraying a faint tremor. "It's not pleasant, but I'll be thorough." "You want the results sent directly to animal control? And a copy for me, if that's allowed?" He nodded, as if it would have been unthinkable to deny. "I'll expedite. Should have it before close of business today." I signed the necessary forms and watched as he sealed the box. There was a formality to it, the way he double-checked the label and handled the tape, and I realized that for all our talk of pets as family, the world treated them as property until the very last. But Dr. Romero's care, his refusal to rush or minimize the task, lent the moment the gravity it deserved. He walked me out to the lobby and handed me a manila envelope with the chart notes inside. "Call me if you need anything," he said, and I understood the offer was broader than just medical updates. I left the clinic, envelope in hand, and sat in my car for several minutes, reading and rereading the printout. The words were merciless in their precision, findings consistent with acute exposure and neglect. No evidence of prolonged illness. The summary was direct, even cold, but to me it was a confession written in another language, a clear line drawn between accident and intent. I inhaled, the air sharp and painful in my chest, and for a moment I could not move. I thought of all the times I'd brought Scout to this same office, the way he'd quivered with anticipation and leaned against my leg for comfort. I thought of the last visit, when Paige had insisted on handling the check-in herself, dismissing my questions with a smile so practiced it might as well have been lacquered. I had the evidence now. It should have felt like victory, but instead, it was just another item in a file that grew heavier by the hour. I pressed the manila envelope to my chest, breathing in the scent of toner and antiseptic, and let myself grieve for one more minute before putting the car in drive. On the way home, I stopped at the grocery store. Out of habit, I bought 2 bags of frozen peas and a pack of index cards. Some rituals, it seemed, were harder to let go than others. Subscribe and share one line you wish you'd heard earlier. Someone will borrow it. By late morning, the sky had settled into its post-rain torpor, and I found myself navigating the maze of low-rise office suites on the city's east side. The directory listed Calderon Law, Animal and Elder Protection, in careful sans serif, Suite 204. The hallway outside her door smelled faintly of Lysol and something citrus, as if the building superintendent had tried to cover decades of old carpet and airless Tuesdays with a single bright gesture. Beatriz Calderon greeted me at precisely 11:29, ushering me into an office that was both minimalist and militarily organized. The bookshelves were arranged by topic: animal law, elder abuse, estate planning, with each spine labeled and many sprouting a regiment of colored sticky flags. Her desk was clear except for a legal pad, a laptop, and 2 neat stacks of folders, one green and one red. She motioned to a client chair, and I sat, taking care not to dislodge the geometric arrangement of the room. She scanned the appointment notes on her screen, then turned her full attention to me. "Mr. Morton, thank you for coming in. I reviewed your message and attachments. I'm sorry for your loss." I nodded, unfamiliar with the etiquette of legal grief, and placed my own folder, printouts, thumb drives, and the manila envelope from Dr. Romero on her desk. "Everything's here," I said, voice rasped from lack of sleep. She pulled the evidence toward her, hands efficient but not unkind. "Let's walk through it. The city prosecutor will need the timeline, supporting documents, and a clear statement of your objective. Are you seeking criminal penalties, civil recourse, or just closure?" "Justice," I said, before realizing the word meant nothing to the forms and statutes that would govern our conversation. "I want what she did, what they did, to matter. I want it on record." She regarded me for a long moment, then opened her laptop and began a template complaint. As we spoke, she prompted for details: dates, times, access history on the property, any prior disputes with Paige or the others. Each answer went into a blank, then a paragraph, then a perfectly formed sentence calibrated for maximum impact and minimum ambiguity. She watched the doorbell footage on her second monitor, pausing to zoom on the teens' faces, the license plate in the driveway, the timestamp. She toggled to the pet Rehomed platform, searching the handle that had been linked to similar cases in the last year. "We'll ask for IP logs and transaction records," she said, typing with staccato precision. "If it's the same party, They're running an unlicensed operation. Liability will be easy to establish. She opened a new window, dictating as she typed. Criminal complaint. Violation of City Code 12.114. Animal abandonment. Supporting exhibits. Doorbell video. Veterinary necropsy. Digital communications. Relief requested. Enforcement. Restitution. Public record. As she compiled the file, she drafted a cease and desist addressed to the teens via their public profiles and a trespass notice for Paige. This revokes her right of entry, effective immediately, Beatrice explained. You'll want to change the locks anyway, but this makes it actionable if she returns. She reviewed the text, then slid it across for my signature. I signed without hesitation, the pen gliding easier than any document I'd held in years. She added a cover letter to the city prosecutor, attaching every file, and CC'd herself and me. If you have any additional correspondence with the parties, forward it. Don't respond directly. Let me filter. We'll send a preservation request to the rehoming site. Make sure nothing disappears before the inquiry. I watched her work, impressed and slightly awed by the way she bent chaos into order with a few keystrokes and the weight of her authority. When she finished, she closed the laptop and stacked the final copies into a folder labeled with my name. Move slow, she advised, the words clipped but somehow compassionate. Speak plain. Let paper hold this. I took the folder, feeling the difference in weight, as if the documents inside had mass and momentum of their own. What happens next? I asked. She smiled, thin but sincere. You wait, and you keep the record clean. If they escalate, we escalate. If the city prosecutor wants more, we give it. Your case is strong, Mr. Morton. But above all, you need to protect yourself. Don't let anyone, especially family, tell you that your care was misplaced. That's a story people tell to let themselves off the hook. She handed me a card with her direct line and email, and I realized I'd never before felt the urge to hug an attorney. I settled for a firm handshake and a nod, then walked the length of the sterile hallway with the folder pressed to my chest. Outside, the rain had started again, soft but persistent. I unlocked my car, sat behind the wheel, and stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror. For the first time in days, I felt not vindicated but heard, as if every loss, Scout's, my son's, even the incremental erosion of the past, had been acknowledged and preserved in a form that could not be so easily dismissed. I drove home slowly, a stack of papers beside me on the passenger seat. I glanced at the clock, 12:09 p.m., and wondered how long it would take for word to travel, for the balance of my world to realign, even fractionally, toward justice. The house was unchanged when I returned. The leash still hung from its nail, but for the first time I did not pause to touch it. Instead, I placed the legal folder in my filing cabinet, just beneath the Blue Scout folder, and closed the drawer with a finality I wished I could feel inside myself. By Friday, the machinery of justice had begun its slow grind. I woke to a voicemail from Animal Control. This is Officer Chen, Mr. Morton. Wanted to inform you that citations for animal abandonment have been issued to the relevant parties. The city prosecutor has assigned a case number. You'll receive official notice by mail. His tone was as clinical as ever, but the underlying current was one of closure, or as close to closure as these matters permitted. 2 hours later, I received an email from Beatrice. Attached were PDFs of the citations, the language precise and unsparing. Violation of City Code 12.114, knowingly and willfully relinquished custody of dependent animal under conditions likely to cause distress or death. Respondents, Paige Morton and 2 unnamed juveniles. Below this, the addendum from the prosecutor's office. Civil penalty, $2,500 per incident. Mandatory community service, 60 hours, at City Animal Shelter. The specifics were almost surgical. The service was not to involve photo or outreach activities, but rather direct animal care, cleaning, and support. The pet rehoming platform responded too. In a curt form letter, they confirmed that the relevant accounts had been permanently banned and that they would comply with law enforcement requests for user data. The teen's online presence, so carefully curated, had been scrubbed overnight. I allowed myself a flicker of satisfaction, then extinguished it. Late in the afternoon, Dr. Romero called. "I have something for you," he said, voice warmer than the last time. "Scouts tags. And a photo I found in the office from when he was a pup. Would you like to come by, or should I mail it?" I drove over before sunset. The clinic was quiet, most of the staff gone for the weekend. Dr. Romero met me in the lobby, a small envelope in his hand. Inside were the tags: red rabies, blue city license, silver heart with my old address etched crooked by the engraver. The photo was matte, not glossy, showing Scout at 3 months, his ears not yet sure whether to stand up or collapse. "I thought you'd want them," Romero said. I nodded, unsure how to express gratitude for a gesture so simple and so immense. Back at home, I placed the envelope on the kitchen table, then sat beside it for nearly an hour before opening the box I'd set aside for keepsakes. I added the tags and the photo to the other artifacts: Wyatt's grade school drawings, an anniversary card from my wife, the first set of house keys I ever owned. Each item was a relic, evidence of a life lived for others, even if the world's response had been as brief and transactional as a customer survey. That evening, I changed the locks. Not dramatic, just necessary. I followed the checklist I'd created, starting with the front door and working my way through every point of entry. The task was familiar, almost comforting. By the time I finished, the sun had dipped behind the fence and the house was held, however briefly, in the hush of twilight. Afterward, I sat on the back step, new keys in my pocket, Scout's tags in my palm. I tried to imagine a world where the act of care was met with equal care, where boundaries were honored not because they were enforced by statute or threat, but because the people on either side understood their value. I wondered if Wyatt had inherited any of this impulse, or if the world had already sanded it away from him, replaced it with the easy logic of convenience. I turned the keys over in my hand, listening to the way they clicked against each other, sharp and certain. It was not the sound of victory, but it was the sound of something lasting, something that would not vanish the next time a storm swept through the city. I had always avoided conflict, preferring to document my disappointments and bury them in the geological layers of the filing cabinet. But some breaches demanded public record, the kind that could be read back into memory with every line and signature. That evening, I set my phone to record and invited Wyatt and Paige to the house. No preamble, just an address and a time, as if I were summoning them to a closing or a deposition. They arrived together, Wyatt's car pulling up first and idling at the curb while Paige lingered in the passenger seat, visible only in the occasional flare of her phone's screen. I watched from behind the kitchen blinds as they argued softly, Wyatt gesturing, Paige keeping her arms folded tight across her chest. Eventually, they walked up the path and rang the bell. I opened the door and stepped aside, not offering the usual handshake or embrace. Instead, I motioned to the dining table, where I'd arranged the evidence in 3 columns: the printed case number, the necropsy summary and doctor, Romero's precise script, and the trespass notice from Calderon Law, highlighted in yellow. We sat. The silence was a tightrope, and none of us seemed eager to break it. Wyatt glanced at the documents, then at me. "Dad, what's going on?" I started with the facts, methodical and unembellished. "Animal Control opened a case," I said. "Dr. Romero performed the necropsy. The city prosecutor has filed citations." I pointed to each item as I spoke, hoping the ritual would lend the words more weight. There's a trespass notice effective immediately, and legal representation for all further communication. Paige picked up the necropsy summary, lips pressed thin as she read. "This feels extreme," she said finally. "We were just... Look, it's not like we meant any harm. Scout was old. He needed a yard. We thought..." My voice trembled as I cut her off. "He needed me. And he needed the people who promised to care for him. That's all he's ever needed." Wyatt's face went red, shame or anger or both. "Dad, I didn't know. I thought Paige talked to you about it." "She did not," I said, then slid the locksmith receipt across the table, heavy with implication. "And from now on, no one comes or goes from this house unless I say so. Not for emergencies, not for errands, not for convenience. That era is over." Paige recoiled, bristling. "So that's it? You're just going to cut us out?" I looked at my son, who for all his adulthood still seemed, in that moment, like the boy who'd shadowed me through half-finished renovations, hoping for praise or at least permission to try. "You're welcome here, Wyatt. You always will be. But you," I said, turning to Paige, "are done making decisions about anything that belongs to me. That includes pets, finances, and..." I paused, searching for the line between firmness and cruelty. My family name. I slid the final letter across. A statement of boundaries, bullet-pointed and notarized by Beatrice. No access. No pet decisions. No use of my name on platforms or paperwork. Any discussions about my grandson would be had in public, at the library on Sundays at 2, with Beatrice on speaker and all documentation visible to both parties. Paige read the letter in silence, then set it down with a deliberate calm. "Understood," she said, voice barely above a whisper. She rose and left the room, her footsteps soft but final down the hallway. Wyatt lingered, eyes red but dry. "Dad," he said, "I really didn't know." "I'm sorry." "I believe you," I replied, "but it's not enough to mean well. Not anymore." We stood awkwardly in the doorway for a moment. Then, as if by old reflex, he reached in for a brief, rough hug. I let him, and for a moment I imagined it was enough to repair something, even as I knew it was only a temporary truce. After they left, I returned to the table and gathered the documents into their folders. I pressed the edge of each page against the wood, aligning them perfectly, and thought about all the times I'd chosen order over confrontation. Maybe it had been cowardice, or maybe just the only language I knew. Either way, the record was set now. The burden of proof was no longer mine alone to carry. That night, I deleted the old code from the smart lock and set a new one, a sequence only I would know. Then I sat in the dark, the house quiet but for the rain on the eaves, and let the ledger of my life click forward by one more line. For me, justice was never an event, but a sequence. Incremental, almost imperceptible in the moment, but unmistakable in retrospect. It was a case number read back to me over the phone, confirming that my complaint had not vanished into the bureaucratic abyss. It was the knowledge that somewhere, in a basement server, the faces of the two teenagers and their pet rehoming aliases were frozen in digital amber, their license plates and IP addresses archived as a future warning. It was the quiet satisfaction of a lock that turned with new resistance, the tumblers clicking into place with the mechanical certainty that had eluded every other part of my life. Justice was the envelope from Dr. Romero's clinic, with Scout's name printed perfectly at the top, and beneath it the words, "Findings, consistent with acute exposure. Cause, neglect. No ambiguity, no open questions, only the factual finality I'd come to crave." I taped the printout inside the keepsake box, so that whenever I opened it, be it a week or a decade from now, I would remember that the story had not ended in silence, but in a verdict. The box itself lived on the top shelf of the hall closet, alongside Wyatt's old report cards and the few letters from my wife I'd allowed myself to keep. Some days, I would take it down and hold the tags in my palm, feeling their different weights, the layers of memory pressed between metal and ink. Each one was a promise. To do better next time, to expect better from those I loved, to never confuse proximity for care or convenience for love. I still misplaced my reading glasses at least twice a day, and more than once I reached for a leash that no longer hung from its hook. I continued to oversalt my pasta, though now I did it on purpose, as a kind of private rebellion against the blandness of modern food. My house was no less quiet, but the silence no longer felt like absence. It felt like rest, earned and inviolable. Once, in a moment of weakness, I checked the rehoming platform to see if the teens or page had returned under new aliases. They had not. The site was a wasteland of free to good home and must rehome ASAP, none of it touching me anymore. I closed the browser and poured myself a cup of coffee, strong and bitter, and sat by the window to watch the sun come up. The word yard had become a curse to me, a stand-in for every easy excuse made in the name of expedience. I vowed never to let it pass my lips as a justification, never to believe that more space or better scenery could substitute for presence. If I ever adopted again, a dog, a friend, even a stray thought, I would do so with the full understanding of what it meant to keep, not just to house. And if anyone ever asked for a key, I would make them sit at the table and recite the rules, line by line, until I was convinced they could carry the burden of love without dropping it at the first inconvenience. I didn't know if the world would ever change, or if my story would matter to anyone but me. But that was the thing about records. Once you kept them, they could not be unwritten. And so I lived, and so I remembered. If any of this rings true, subscribe and leave one sentence, the boundary you'll set this week.